Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Shenanigans with Shreya podcast. Today's episode is actually an episode that has been requested from one of you. A listener recently reached out and asked if I'd ever made an episode that talks about social awkwardness and anxiety and the science behind it, and especially kind of geared towards young people in school and young adults. So, first of all, thank you so much for requesting an episode. I always love to hear any sort of request because everything is so interesting and we love to talk about it. And I'd also like to normalize something just from the very start of this episode that if you've ever walked into a classroom, a university lecture hall, a party, like anywhere that you've entered and you felt this, wave of self-consciousness, like everyone is staring at you, judging your walk, analyzing what you're wearing. It's okay, guys. Like you're experiencing a very highly coordinated survival mechanism that we've had for years as humans. And in today's episode, we are going into a very, very deep dive into the architecture. And the intention is that we're going to hold this sort of masterclass today because this is quite an important topic. It's more than just a surface level believe in yourself sort of advice situation. We are going to break down the exact neuroanatomy of an anxious brain, look at why being a teenager can physically supercharge these feelings, expose how school buildings are designed in a way to actually spike our stress, and then look at the long-term shadows that this can cast into your young adulthood. And most importantly, we're going to discuss how literal neuroplasticity can structurally rewire your neural pathways to build more confidence, to build more self-belief. So let's get to it. To start off, we really need to understand how anxiety is built. So, what is really happening in our bodies when we experience anxiety? Anxiety is an umbrella term. There are many different categories. We're going to break down the three major archetypes from a brain and behavioral perspective. So, the first one is generalized anxiety disorder, which isn't really about a specific event. It is usually a state of constant, excessive, and unrealistic worrying about everyday things. It could be health, family, school, money, whatever it is. In a way, it's like if your brain was a computer. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is this heavy data draining software that's just running in the background all the time. In studies where they've done fMRI brain scans of individuals that have GAD, they show this hyperconnectivity within areas of the brain like the default mode network and a breakdown in communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So essentially what this means is that your brain's cognitive brake system stops working. Your prefrontal cortex, which is the decision center of the brain, and the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, don't have that much communication anymore. That's been broken down. So it's essentially hard to actually tell your amygdala, your emotional smoke detector, to calm down by your rational brain, your prefrontal cortex, which leads to this constant cycle of worrying and what if thinking. Another category of anxiety is panic disorder. Panic disorder is essentially unexpected panic attacks that can happen recurrently, where there's a sudden wave of intense fear that can peak within quite a few minutes, accompanied by some really tough physical sensations like racing heart, feeling pain in your chest, a shortness of breath. And what's happening is that it's essentially this malfunction of your brain's threat detection system. So the origination of a panic attack is usually deep in the brainstem, specifically in a structure called the locus coeruleus, which is the main place in the brain that actually makes the hormone noradrenaline. During a panic attack, this specific area, the locus coeruleus, really floods your entire nervous system with noradrenaline quite instantly, which triggers this unprovoked, full-blown fight or flight response in your entire body. And your brain genuinely believes that it's dying because it's full of so much adrenaline just for that second. The next type of anxiety is the social anxiety disorder, or SAD. So social anxiety is this intense, persistent fear of being perceived, honestly, of being watched, of being judged, of being, negatively thought of by other people. And just communicating to someone in a shop, asking a barista something. Social anxiety is in a glitch. So earlier, as humans, we were within tribes, right? And being isolated from your tribe would mean that you're literally going to die. And our brain has evolved to view social rejection as a survival threat on par with like a physical predator. So when your social anxiety fires, it's the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, that lights up quite intensely, immediately starving your decision-making cortex, your prefrontal cortex, and you freeze up because your brain has literally diverted all its resources just towards like survival, which is the fear center. It's one of the oldest components, the oldest parts of our brain, like evolutionary wise, and it is the part that acts up quite a lot. And if it starts acting up, you're in fight or flight mode by default. So that's what's happening in social anxiety. Now, no matter what type of anxiety a person has, they all eventually activate the exact same biological system, essentially, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is a mouthful, I'm aware. We're going to call it the HPA axis. So the hypothalamus is, again, part of your brain. All these words are part of our brain. So hypothalamus releases something called CRH. And by releasing CRH, it signals to our adrenal glands to start dumping cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream. And that's what makes your heart rate start to skyrocket, your digestion starts to shut down, which causes nausea sometimes, and your breathing starts to become shallow because your biology is trying to save your life and it doesn't realize that this is just, you trying to talk to someone or you trying to order something. This is how anxiety flares up in your body and can essentially cause these emotional reactions to what may seem like a simple situation, but anxiety can perceive it as a different situation. So coming to the next part of this that we wanted to discuss is, why does it feel like a complete truck has hit us during our teenage years and early 20s? Because statistically, the vast majority of anxiety disorders that happen in people happen before the age of 21. And if you really think about it, this isn't really a coincidence. It's a direct result of the structural development that's happening in the adolescent brain remodel in a teenager's brain. So, fun brain fact, guys. The human brain develops from the back to the front, which is why you might have heard that, it's only in your mid-20s, around 25, when your prefrontal cortex, which is the very front of your brain, fully develops. And we're like, oh, we can actually make decisions now. And essentially, during puberty, during adolescence, the emotional reward seeking and threat processing centers, which combine under the term of the limbic system, they undergo this massive growth spurt that is triggered by a lot of hormones that are released during puberty. However, as I said earlier, the prefrontal cortex, which is the analytical and logical center that regulates the emotional spikes in our body, this is not fully wired until you are roughly 25 years old. So even for myself, it's like we're still growing. I'm still growing. My brain is not fully developed yet. And there's something really cool about that, but there's something that we also need to understand, which essentially means that teenagers have a lot of sensitive energy, a lot of emotional energy just running within the brain, running within the system, but the braking system or the decision-making system, which is the prefrontal cortex, it has not been fully installed yet. So every worry, every panic, every anxiety-inducing feeling feels very permanent and feels like it could be catastrophic. And it might not seem that way if you had your prefrontal cortex fully developed, maybe at the age of 25 and above. But when you're a teenager, you can't seem to put a brake on that system because you quite literally have not fully developed that part. So especially between 12 and 22 years of age, your brain is hyperplastic. It undergoes so much structural clearing called synaptic pruning, which essentially means that if your brain is using a pathway, it's going to keep it. And if it's not using a pathway and it notices that it hasn't been using a pathway for a while, it's going to get rid of it. Literally spring cleaning your brain for 10 years roughly. And if your brain spends these emotionally sensitive and hyperformative years in your teens constantly activating anxiety pathways, because it could be school stress, it could be social isolation, it could be bullying, which unfortunately a lot of secondary school, high school kids tend to deal with. These pathways that are constantly becoming active, these anxiety pathways, they're going to become reinforced because your brain is using them. The brain is not going to get rid of them, and then they become permanent structural pathways in your brain. And when we talk about puberty, puberty floods a lot of the brain with estrogen and testosterone, which interacts quite directly with the neurotransmitting system because everything is a chemical in our brain, right? Which makes the fear center, the amygdala, significantly much more reactive to safety, to perception of how other people are perceiving you. There's also an increase in oxytocin receptors during adolescence, which doesn't just make people social, it again supercharges their sensitivity to feeling excluded by people and amplifying this internal stress that can happen and amplify social anxiety in general. So if you really think about it, there's also another factor within anxiety that is quite often overlooked, which is environmental architecture. So the physical spaces where students and young adults tend to exist, which is usually schools and university-like locations, they're very structurally optimized to cultivate chronic anxiety. And we're going to talk about this now because most schools and institutional buildings, visually and auditory-wise, can be quite a lot. Like if you really think about it, there's this high-frequency fluorescent lighting that's used in libraries and in classrooms, and they constantly have this like subtle high frequency flicker that even though your conscious mind might ignore it, you might not register it after being in the room for a bit, your optic nerve does register it because your optic nerve in your eye is basically transmitting all the visual data. Constant flickering is something that is increasing your baseline nervous system, and it's kind of slowly elevating cortisol because when you're exposed to a flickering light, essentially your light receptors in your eye, your photoreceptors, they're constantly forced to like switch on and off because there's firing that keeps on happening. And this continuous firing when something is flickering in your visual system is going to make the brain think that there's something stressful happening in your environment because the light switch keeps going on and off, on and off. And this overload will then start to slowly activate the HPA axis that we spoke about earlier, which will release something called CRH. It's a hormone. And again, it will trigger the cortisol and adrenaline in your body, which is why sitting under harsh flickering lights, whether it's in a classroom or in a library or even in an office building, it really does leave you feeling completely wired and anxious, and your body is locked in the state of fight or flight, essentially. And if you combine this with the echo of corridors and the packed hallways all the time, like a lot of people all at once, your nervous system is going to be pushed into this artificial sensory overloaded state of hyper vigilance and paying attention all the time before you even actually sit down and learn anything. If you think about like a traditional classroom or lecture hall layout, there's just rows of desks facing towards the board, right? And if you sit anywhere in this classroom, maybe not the back row, but literally anywhere else in this classroom, you have this massive blind spot behind you because from an evolutionary perspective, a blind spot is where you actually can't really see if you're being observed or if you're being targeted, and it constantly initiates survival simulation. Your brain will subconsciously try to track invisible threats behind you, like, oh, is someone looking at me from behind? Things like that, that directly feed into generalized worry and social paranoia. Because school can be stressful sometimes because of like the amount of studying that you have to do, but it's also stressful because the literal layout of school tricks your very primal, raw, evolutionary brain into feeling trapped, into feeling like you're always being perceived. And that constant, almost having to be aware and hyper vigilant all the time leads to burnout very quickly. And since we have spoken a lot about like the structure of anxiety and how it works, how do we use this knowledge? How do we use neuroscience to actually systematically dismantle it, right? Something that I think is so important that everyone really registers is that our brains are neuroplastic, which means that we can quite literally rewire our brains as we wish. We have so much power, and it's incredible how much you can actually do if you realize that you have this power, and you can fold your perception of reality to your whim, which is really cool. But anyways, yeah, so our brains are neuroplastic. We can quite literally manually clear away these anxiety pathways and build pathways that are more geared towards confidence. So here is a neurowiring protocol, if you'd like to call it that, based on exactly what type of anxiety you are facing. So if we think about panic attacks, when a panic attack hits, you really cannot reason or use your rational mind that much. Like you can't think your way out of this because you are literally in like a psychological storm. So we need to use physiology to rewire this. There is a hack that's been popularized by a neurobiologist called Dr. Huberman, which is the fastest way to manually override a panic response would be to take 2 deep consecutive inhales through your nose. So like a deep breath and then a sharp inhale right at the top to fully inflate your lungs. And then you really, really slowly exhale through your mouth. And so when you double inhale, so when you reach the very top and inhale again, it opens these little air sacs in your lungs called alveoli, which allows a lot of carbon dioxide to be offloaded when you start to exhale slowly. And this immediately triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. It slows down your heart rate very quickly, so under 30 seconds usually, and it sends a signal to your brainstem saying that you are safe. When you breathe slowly, it signals to your body that you're okay and that you're trying to activate your calming nervous system, so your parasympathetic nervous system. For generalized background anxiety, if your brain feels like it's in a trapped loop of worrying all the time, there is a hack that sounds like I've made it up, but I promise I haven't. It's an actual thing that people use. But essentially, if you set a timer, let's say for 15 minutes at 4 o'clock every day, it could be any time, that can become your designated window. Like you've actually planned your time to worry. So that's your window to worry as hard as you can. Write down absolutely every single thought, every single worry, catastrophe that's going to happen on paper. And if, say, for example, you have an anxious thought that pops up at 10 o'clock, you just tell your brain, hey, I'm not going to deal with this right now. I'm going to deal with this at 4 o'clock when I have my worry window. So the idea of this is that you're breaking the cycle of cognitive fusion, which is essentially where you mistake that your anxious thoughts are actually reality. And by writing them down within the 15 minutes that you've given yourself in your worry window, you start to actually externalize the thoughts. You push them away momentarily. You put them in a drawer, in a box somewhere in the back of your mind that you'll come back to later. And it essentially moves you out of the hyperactive default mode network in the brain that's happening all the time and lets you go back to your prefrontal cortex, the decision logical part of your brain, much more quickly. Learning how to compartmentalize like that is quite healthy to deal with generalized background anxiety. And you might even find out with doing this for some time that you become better at pushing anxious thoughts away and coming back to them later. And when you see them on paper, sometimes you realize that this is actually not as bad as I'm making it seem in my head. And social anxiety kind of forces you to really, really obsessively be self-conscious of yourself because you're being perceived in the situation. So it can be your own heart rate, your voice, your awkwardness, like you're judging yourself pretty hard in a case of social anxiety. So the next time that you feel socially overwhelmed, it is very important to remember that you are in full control of this, right? So there's something called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding method. You can name 5 things you see in the room, 4 things you physically feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste. And by doing this, you're kind of forcing your brain to snap out of it, out of the own kind of loop of fear that your brain is in, and forces your attention to go to sensory data. And this disrupts the spotlight effect, which is a very known cognitive bias where you believe that everyone is hyperanalyzing your flaws and perceiving you exactly how you are. Something to remember, guys, is that no one apart from yourself actually pays as much attention to you. Everyone is so fixated on themselves. And that's the funny part, that we think that other people are fixated on us, but they're fixated on themselves as well. So no matter what type of anxiety, it is really important to remember that you cannot really wait until you feel ready to do the right thing, to face the room and to talk to people and to give the presentation. It is important that you do execute your tasks, like you do give the presentation, you do talk to people, even when you're feeling scared and messy and uncomfortable, because by doing so, the brain will review this data in real time. You will quite literally realize that, okay, I did not die, I'm okay. And then these perceived threats that seem so big and scary, they start to become smaller and smaller. You start to down-regulate the amygdala's threat level for next time. This is how you structurally rewire your brain, by literally just exposing yourself more to the things that scare you. Call it exposure therapy, if you will, but it is important to allow yourself to experience that instead of thinking that you know how it's going to be experienced when you haven't experienced it yet, right? And to wrap up this episode today, I do want to leave you with a thought. So anxiety is not a reflection of your character. It's not an indicator of your worth or your intelligence or your future. It's just, a state of high protectiveness in this beautiful nervous system of ours that's tuned up its volume a little bit too high. So thank you for the request. And essentially, this request has allowed us to build this blueprint that will hopefully help a lot of young people realize that, hey, this is something that can be managed. Like, I am not my anxiety. I can manage this. And if this episode gave you any sort of clarity today, do share it with a friend, a classmate, a parent, anyone who would like to have a look at what the anxious mind looks like. Do practice your deep breathing exercises. Claim your physical space and remember that you hold all the tools to rewire your brain and to make it do as you wish. And also don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. It really helps the podcast grow. But yeah, thank you so much for listening and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.